what's the mission of these schools? They're not teaching the kids the fundamental skills they need to enter the workforce, or really even to get into college and be productive. They're teaching them this radical ideology. And it's just, we've got to get more parents involved and just really take control of this process and put the parents back in the driver's seat.
Hey, Joyful Warriors. Welcome to the Joyful Warrior podcast. I'm really excited to be joined by a friend, someone that I got to meet in D.C. At a party where he was introducing that he was running again for Congress. Yes, Joe Kent is joining us today. So Joe ran in 2022 for Washington's 3rd congressional district. He lost by less than a percentage point. So it was a very, very close race. And Joe is from, as I said, Washington State. So excited to learn a little bit more about Washington State. Joe, we don't have a lot of people on the podcast from up your way, but we do have quite a few chapters in Washington. And you guys experienced COVID I think in a very unique way compared to many across the country. So excited to talk with you today. Welcome to the Joyful Warrior podcast.
Really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Wonderful. Thank you. So Joe, first of all, thank you for your service. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, served in the military for a little over 20 years, did 11 combat deployments, so it was a Green Beret, spent a lot of time overseas fighting our wars over there. My late wife was also in the military. She was killed fighting ISIS in Syria about 1 month after Trump tried to get our troops out the first time. So that kind of thrust me into this political world because I saw what the administrative state could do to just really thwart the best intentions of a president who was trying to put our country first. So I'd never intended on running for Congress, but kind of found myself in this position when my Republican congresswoman decided to vote for Trump's impeachment. So that kind of got me politically engaged, but also COVID, the riots that we had out here in the Pacific Northwest, and then just the erosion of parental rights. I have 2 young sons. They're 6 and 8 years old. I currently homeschool them because the state schools here in Washington have just gone so far out of the bounds of anything that I ever thought I'd see in my own country. It's really perverse. It's really crazy. So, fighting for the future of our children, that's why I'm in this fight.
Well, thank you to you for your service and to your late wife, Shannon. I know that must have been incredibly difficult. And then as a single dad, I think I heard that you've recently found love again and gotten remarried. So many congratulations to you and your life. But there is no doubt being a single dad must have been difficult and losing your wife in that manner. So thank you. So you throw your hat in the ring, you decide to run for office in Washington State. You talk a little bit about COVID and what you experienced in Washington. Let's dive a little bit more into that. When I was starting Moms for Liberty, when Tina and I first started, I would talk to moms in Washington State and Oregon. I think you're originally from Oregon. Am I right?
Yep, okay. My district's right on the border. Yeah, I'm just from the Oregon side. Yeah.
Okay. I think it was Sweet Home, Oregon. Is that true? That's a great name for a town or a city, Sweet Home, Oregon.
Yeah, that's where I was born, actually, in a little cabin.
Okay, wonderful. But when I would talk to moms from the West Coast, but again, Washington, Oregon, they were a mess. They were so upset and it was so frustrating. It was like they had even forgotten that parental rights existed. There had been such a level of indoctrination and the state really dictating every facet of your lives in Washington State that moms really didn't know where to start pushing back. So talk to me a little bit about what that was like as a dad.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really confusing time. Obviously, the initial couple months of COVID, no one really knew what was going on. So I think we all kind of accepted, hey, let's lock down, let's listen to the government. But then being able to see behind the curtain, as so many people could because of classrooms being put on Zoom, we really saw what was being taught in the schools. My kids were pretty young, so we were a little bit sheltered from that. But I started talking with my friends and my neighbors, and just seeing what the kids were being taught, how radical the ideology was, whether it was critical race theory, being taught that America is systemically evil, but then really the sexual indoctrination. And this has been a burning issue here in Washington State for quite a while. We have what I'm sure you guys are familiar with. It's called comprehensive sex ed, which is completely radical. It doesn't resemble the sex ed that I was given in public schools when I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s. It's completely radical. It has this trans ideology just baked into it. And that ideology has really permeated into pretty much every aspect of education. And that's why so many parents are pulling their kids out of the schools. But we saw that during COVID, and the lockdowns here didn't really end almost until 2022. We had lockdowns up until the summer of 21. We had mask mandates. Kids were being told they had to wear masks during sporting activities. Just the utmost amount of control the government could seize away from the people. And the rules were ever changing, and the rules only seemed to apply to one side. But really, pretty much every bit of control and transparency the parents had was taken away from them. And I'm sure we'll get more into this here in a minute, but just recently we've had this bill called SB 5599 that basically allows the states to kidnap your kids away from you. If your kids believe some of this indoctrination and they say, hey, I'm confused about what my gender is and my parents don't support this, the school has an obligation to not tell the parents what the kids are telling the guidance counselors. And then the schools and the state can basically take the kids away from the parents and give them, so-called gender affirming care, which is really just chemical castration or a mutilating surgery. So it is complete and total insanity out here. Even when I articulate it, I don't fully believe that it's the reality. Had I not lived it and had I not seen this get codified into law, but that's unfortunately the sad state of parental rights in Washington State right now.
So why run for Congress? Why not run for House or Senate in Washington? What skills do you think you're bringing, and what are you hoping to achieve at the federal level? Because you just mentioned one of the bills that got passed in Washington. Some of these bills are horrific that we're seeing: Washington, Oregon, California, and they're making their way across the country. So I'm curious what your motivation is and what you hope to do if you reach Congress.
Well, actually, here in my district, we have pretty solid state reps that are fighting. They're fighting a very uphill battle. I don't envy them. They have to go to Olympia, where that body is really controlled heavily by folks from Seattle, King County, those types of areas. So for me, it was finding a place where my skill set, my experience in the military, the federal government. I worked in the intelligence community for a while, where my skills could best plug in. And there was a major gap with federal leadership. My time in the military, I was both an enlisted guy, but I was also a warrant officer. So being able to bridge that gap between management and leadership is something that I specialized in overseas at war. And I think that ties in nicely with what the role of a congressman is, which is really to bridge the gap and be the closest touch point that citizens have with Washington, D.C. And a big issue we have here in blue states is that we basically have nobody fighting for us. And at the federal level, I think there's some key things that could be done to enshrine parental rights, tie the federal funding, the federal education money to ensure that parents actually have transparency. That's something that this last Republican Congress has attempted to do with the Parental Bill of Rights. My opponent and every single Democrat voted against basic transparency for the parents. And then also codifying into law that biological men cannot go into women's locker rooms, women's bathrooms, compete against them in athletics. I think that's something we could do from the federal level. Again, my opponent and every Democrat voted against that in this last Congress. So I think there's lots of things we can do from the federal level, but I'm in this fight because I think my skills on the federal side really tie nicely into being able to fight for the people in the district in Washington, D.C.
Wonderful. So I'll be honest with you, I wasn't a huge fan of HR 5, the Parents' Bill of Rights. I think it's important for us to find the proper role of the federal government when we're talking about education, right? So give us a bit of a sense. You're hoping to head to Washington. How is education going in Washington State, where you're located? How are the kids doing in school?
They're doing terribly. I mean, we have some of the worst test scores in the entire country right now. And that's because what's being prioritized is this radical ideology. It's because of the gaps that developed during COVID. And so right now, unfortunately, there's some really good teachers out there, I think, that are fighting hard and they're trying to do the right things by the students. But the administrative control of our education system is just working against education. So look, from the federal perspective, I don't think the federal government has any role in, in telling the states how to handle their business with education. However, if we can't completely and totally abolish the federal Department of Education, which I would like to do, but if we can't do that, I want to be able to weaponize and use the federal education grants to strip out every single bit of this radical ideology and to give the parents some basic transparency. I understand if I was in a red state, I would feel the exact same way. I would say, hey, just keep the federal government out of it 110%. For where we're at right now, I want to be able to use every bit of power that we have at the federal level to give give parents transparency and really just to expose and to starve the beast. The more that we can get our kids to get out of the schools. I homeschool my kids. We're very blessed and lucky that we can do that. I know every parent can't. This is why I think pushing some form of school choice would be a great idea. It should come from the governors, but for folks like us that are here in a blue state, our governors are not going to cooperate. They're not going to go along with that. So I would like there to be some form of a federal voucher system, tax deduction, some way that we can start getting parents to pull their kids out of the education system just to starve the beast and give parents more control.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And we say that parents have the fundamental right to direct the education of their children, their upbringing, but their education, their medical care, their morality, their religion. And there's so much overreach happening right now by the federal government into the state education systems through the grant programs. You're absolutely right. So that's a great way to go forward so that there are laws that are currently in the books, federal laws like the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, that say that a lot of this stuff shouldn't be happening, that there needs to be transparency in the classroom for parents, that there shouldn't be any surveys given to students regarding political affiliation or religious beliefs. But you and I both know, and I mean, certainly in Washington state, this is happening all over the place, isn't it?
It most certainly is. Look, the administrators that are running these schools, the vast majority of them, I think, are pretty dedicated leftists, at least here in Washington State. And then the other ones are just afraid of losing their jobs. They want to keep their pensions. They don't want to make any ripples. And so basically, whatever the administration puts out, they amplify, whether that's the trans ideology that confuses our children, whether it's CRT, whatever the case is, and just making everything very much highly politicized. I did a few events in the lead up to the last election at local high schools and in the libraries. And I was just astonished just walking around, looking at some of the books, but also just looking at the posters that are just talking about, trans rights, gay rights. I mean, they're making it to be this very cool thing to be trans or to be homosexual or whatever. And most of this is happening, I think, without parents' knowledge. If they're not actually physically going into the schools and observing the curriculum, they're just simply not aware of this because people are busy. And I understand that. But at the same time, it's like, what's the mission of these schools? They're not teaching the kids the fundamental skills they need to enter the workforce or really even to get into college and be productive. They're teaching them this radical ideology. And it's just, we've got to get more parents involved and just really take control of this process and put the parents back in the driver's seat.
So let's dive into a little bit your military background and how that informs your perspective. So you go into a library, you're going into a school, and you're seeing pride flags all over the place. And I want to be clear again, I say this every podcast I do where we discuss this. We've got gay members, we've got members with gay kids. This isn't about sexual orientation. My children do not need a sexual spirit guide at school. I believe that they need to learn how to read, write, do math, right? But they don't need someone guiding them on their sexual orientation journey. But what does it mean to you as a veteran when you walk into schools and you're seeing these other flags being flown and maybe not even the American flag?
Yeah, I was a Green Beret, so unconventional warfare is something I specialized in. And walking into a school and seeing the flags of other countries, seeing these essentially these made up flags. I mean, the pride flag gets a new symbol or a new color added to it. I think every June they unveil the new pride flag that has another group that's included in it. But seeing this, to me, it's very clear indoctrination. Yes, the trans ideology and the gay agenda, that's pretty unique to the United States. However, if you just look at the basic methodology, this is the exact same thing that's done the world over. The Cultural Revolution that we saw in China, the way that Mao really sought to break up the nuclear family and to take control of the children. And you hear Biden use a lot of this language. He says there are kids. It's very nefarious when you really look at the underpinnings and what they're trying to do. And for me, it all goes back to control. They're trying to take away the things that unite us, which is what our national flag does, or the American flag unites us regardless of your sexual orientation, your skin color, any of that. It says, hey, we're all Americans. You're here at an American public school, and this is what unites us. Having all these different subgroups is done, very deliberately. It's done to confuse kids. It's done to break up the nuclear family, and it's done to pit people against each other. It's really about division, and it's really about giving the people that control the system, this managerial class, giving them control. So I see it as, very sophisticated unconventional warfare and psychological warfare that's being waged on the American people. And the critical terrain, the hill that they want to take, so to speak, is our children to break up the nuclear family.
And we saw that in the Black Lives Matters tenets when they first came out. A destruction of the nuclear family was one of the things that they were focused on doing. And so I think it's important for people to understand. So you just talked a little bit about unconventional warfare. I wonder if you could dive a little bit more into that, what you've seen, or give us some examples in history. You just mentioned a few examples, but I think it's important, first of all, maybe talk about what it means to be a Green Beret, right? For people that may not be familiar with what that means, what your role is within the U.S. Army Special Forces. And then again, I think we're coming to a point in America where American parents are saying, like, wait a second, why is this happening? This is so antithetical to our belief system. It's so subversive, right? They're not trying to change our minds, but they certainly are trying to capture the children. And so, what is that? Let's talk a little bit more about that, and maybe some things that we can do to push back against it.
Yeah, so Green Berets, we're the guys that go behind enemy lines, and yeah, we can do all the traditional, kicking the doors and go after the bad guys types of missions. But our hallmark, what makes us unique within special operations, is that we go in and we recruit and we train local forces, indigenous forces, to work against terrorist organizations, or in some cases, to even overthrow governments. So this is where I kind of put on my Green Beret hat when I'm walking through schools and I see these pride flags and I start looking at the curriculum, because we don't always go in, kicking in doors and shooting and parachuting in and all that stuff. There's a lot of countries that we work in where we're working on the information warfare, we're working on the psychological warfare, and we are attempting to persuade people of our ideology to break them away from whatever held them together. Now, usually we're doing this against Al Qaeda, against ISIS, against the Chinese Communist Party, against very radical ideologies. But right now we're seeing that playbook being ran against us. And this is, like I said, this is nothing new. Radical Islamic extremists have been using this for quite some time. They use religion as their cudgel. But then also, if you look at the Cultural Revolution, I think, is really key to study, because one of the first things that the Maoists did was they tried to break up the nuclear family. They tried to make basically every kid an informant against their parents. And then they would have these struggle sessions where people have to say, like, I've spoken ill against our communist leaders who are just trying to do the right thing for the great people of China. We're seeing the same thing play out here in America, where the parents are being pitted, or the kids are being pitted against the parents. And now the kids, especially in Washington State with 5599, the kids can now go to the school administrators and say, look, my parents, they don't believe what you guys have taught me. They don't believe this ideology, and they're not affirming my gender. And they're able to completely and totally cut the parents out. So I think we fight back, number one, by participating in local elections. We just had a local election, 2 days ago, where unfortunately our participation in Washington State for eligible voters, it was under 20%. And these were really key fights. We actually, here at the local level, we got some really solid people elected to city council and to our school board. So we had some really small victories, but I think we could have had many, many more if we could have driven out voter participation much more. And then parents got to get involved. I know homeschooling is very challenging, especially in this economy where both parents basically have to work just to keep their heads above water. But if there's any way that people can do that to get their kids out of the school system, it's not as hard as you think. Our church has a co-op. We do the classical conversations methodology, but there's so many different kinds of co-ops that are out there. Some are religious, some are not. But really what that does, that gives the parents much more control. And it's challenging here in Washington State. We don't have school choice like we should. So I think fighting for candidates that are going to fight for school choice to get rid of a lot of the funding systems that are going to fund and fuel this ideology, I think that's critical. But really, people got to get active. I go to school board meetings all the time, and a lot of times there's no one there. There's really just the left there driving their ideology, and it's not overt. It's them really just having this subtle control, and they make it all seem very normal. But the second parents start showing up and say, "Hey, what are you putting in my kid's library? What is this book? Let me read this book out loud." We've all seen those videos on YouTube, but it's really powerful when you actually go and you watch this happen. We've got a great local school district here, La Center, very small town, but the superintendent and the school board basically said that they would not comply with 5599. That if a kid comes to them, their first phone call is to the parent. Antifa and a bunch of other groups came and tried to raise hell at their school board meetings. We had a bunch of patriots go and show their support that we actually have these leaders' backs, and it's been great to see the community really show up and get engaged and participate. And that's what we need. We need people to participate.
No, absolutely. I absolutely agree. So you've got a lot of parents with younger children right now watching what's happening in the world. So given your military background, how do you think that informs your approach to national security and foreign policy? A lot of questions about the state of unrest that we're seeing in many different countries and the role that America is playing in that.
Most certainly. I mean, look, I spent most of my adult life overseas fighting in our nation's wars. And unfortunately, I'd like to tell you that we accomplished our mission and it was all worth it. But at the end of the day, we got to realize that we spent somewhere between $8 and $7 trillion on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, lost nearly 7,000 Americans, and the country is not better off because of it. We were lied to. The only people who gained anything from those wars were military defense contractors in Washington, D.C. And now we have a situation where we have leaders in charge like Joe Biden, like the Democrat Party, that have left our border wide open. We've got fentanyl pouring across the border, killed over 108,000 Americans. My state, Washington State, is leading the nation right now in fentanyl deaths. So we have this very bizarre approach to national security right now, where we're told that we have to care deeply about what's happening in countries thousands of miles away, but it's wrong for us to demand our own border to be secured. And I think we've got to call that out for what it is. It's absolutely destroying us. And we've got to say, look, our only duty is really to protect and to provide for our people. Let's finally, once and for all, put our citizens first. That doesn't mean we can't support allies like we have in Israel, but there's ways to do it that we don't get more deeply engaged in these conflicts. And really, at the end of the day, our obligation is to secure our border and have basic law and order so that we can live in peace and prosperity here in America.
So, how will you ensure that voters' voices in Washington state are heard in Washington, D.C.? Because sometimes it feels like the farther away you are from Washington, D.C., the less input that you get to have as a voter in some of these different things that are happening, right? You feel a little disconnected. And so, how will you work to ensure that?
A big thing is really understanding that your elected official, your representative, that's your conduit to the federal government. So I think it's incumbent for those representatives to aggressively and loudly represent the interests of their people, their constituents in Washington D.C. They can't just go along to get along. In my first race, I took down a 12-year incumbent from the Republican Party, and now I'm going against an incumbent from the Democrat Party. So when I get to Washington D.C., I will have defeated two incumbents, one from each party. I will not be beholden to anyone. So a lot of times, people, when they start running for office, the party will come in very early and back them with a lot of money. And then once you're backed with a lot of money, then you owe favors, and then you're not actually pursuing the agenda of the people in your district. I run off of small dollar donations. I don't take any money from any of the corporate super PACs or any of that type of stuff. So really for me, it's all about accountability. And I won my initial primary by doing about 350 in-person town halls over the course of 18 months and knocking on my team and I knocked on over 130,000 doors. So constant engagement with the people, I think, is absolutely critical. It's really incumbent to have our elected officials come back and do town halls where they're not scripted, where anybody can just come and raise an issue and discuss what's happening in Washington, D.C., so that there's actual accountability there. I think that's key. That's one of my number one promises to the people in the district is that I'll always come back and do in-person town halls. You don't have to write down the question ahead of time. It's not pre-screened by my staff. You can just come and tell me what's on your mind or ask me a question. I think that the accountability and the transparency is key.
So you're walking into Washington now. Let's say you've been elected. There's been a little bit of a shakeup in the House of Representatives. I'm going to tell you from what I've seen on the ground with Americans, they like the disruption. I think that there's a certain amount of this foregone conclusion that we've seen in politics and certainly within the Republican Party. I know when I ran for office, the Democrats didn't like me. The Republicans didn't like me. They had already chosen a different candidate. And so I won with 60% of the vote, but I wasn't really being backed by any type of political party and apparatus in my district and my community. People are ready to stop asking permission, I think, right? So what has your take been watching the speaker's race? The first one with Kevin McCarthy, 15 rounds, and then this, last move by Matt Gaetz to remove McCarthy. And now we have Speaker Mike Johnson. I testified before his committee in the judiciary. So what have your thoughts been about everything that's been happening?
I'm really excited that we have Speaker Johnson in there. I think he's got a fantastic track record. He's not beholden to anyone either. So I'm really excited that he's there. I agree with you. I think that the shakeup and the violation of the status quo is a good thing. Because look, if the status quo was working, we wouldn't be in this position right now. We wouldn't be $34 trillion in debt. Our border wouldn't be wide open. There wouldn't be, we wouldn't be on the verge of World War III. But that's just not the case. The current system is not working. And so when you get people who actually have the courage to say, look, I present an alternative idea, I think the American people are really, really responding well to that. I think they're really embracing that because they understand, even if you don't follow politics that much, you understand at a very basic gut level that things are not right now. So this is the time for us to take drastic and bold action. So I couldn't be more excited. I think Speaker Johnson's off to a good start. I mean, they've got a couple very hard fights coming up here. I appreciate the fact that he is not putting us further in debt. He found a way to give Israel the funding they needed, but he took that money away from the bloated and weaponized IRS. That to me right there is the template. He didn't say, hey, let's go further in debt. He said, look, if we have to support an ally, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find a way to pay for it, just like we all have to with our businesses, with our families. The fact that they're actually doing individual appropriations bills, I think a lot of the noise gets really confusing out there for people who don't follow the details. You hear that Matt Gaetz and these guys are coming in, the Freedom Caucus, they're coming in, they're just creating chaos. Well, the chaos was them saying that, hey, we shouldn't do these massive 5,000 page omnibus bills. We should actually do individual appropriations bills, and we should live within our means. That's probably about the most moderate common sense thing I've ever heard. And so to watch the mainstream media then turn and attack them, you see where the moneyed interests are. The moneyed interests are with this status quo because that's how they're all getting paid. That's the corruption that's destroying our country. So I'm pretty happy with the way things are right now. I hope Mike Johnson stays the course. I think he will. So far so good. It's going to be a hard fight going into 24. It's going to be a hard fight this next month as they negotiate the budget.
Absolutely. And you're right. I mean, from what I've seen serving in elected office, if the protectors of the status quo never like change and they want to try to pit you as some type of chaos agent, right? Oh, everything's falling apart. There was we did an interview recently and the reporter was asking about a school district that had to go through a review process of like 90 books or something and said, they're not able to do anything else. They have to do these book reviews. And I was like, come on now, like, school districts can walk and chew gum at the same time. The idea that, having to go through a certain process is going to keep them from doing all of their other work is just ridiculous. But that is the narrative that's being sown. And so tell us a little bit about what your race was like last time and how the media handled that, how you feel like you were portrayed in Washington State, and then what you hope for the future. I mean, I want you to be able to speak to the voters of your district and tell them, like, why should they vote for you, right? Why should you represent them in Congress?
Yeah, certainly. Last cycle was very challenging. We had a really hotly contested primary, so I ran against a 12-year incumbent in the primary. But we have open primaries, jungle primaries here, so we actually had about 4 really strong Republicans on the ballot. And look, it was a bloodletting. It was a very hard-fought primary. When I emerged as the Republican nominee in August, we had a very fractured Republican Party. Our primaries are late, so our primary is in August. It takes us 2 weeks to count ballots here in Washington State, which is a whole different topic. So our election really wasn't sorted out until mid-August. We do all mail-out ballots here. So the ballots for the general election got dropped about 5.5 weeks later. So unfortunately, I didn't have the time to go out and unify the Republican Party, despite my best efforts. I also had 14 million spent against me in the primary. A lot of that was, almost all of that was fratricide coming from the Republican side. So I was fresh out of money once I was the Republican nominee. And then unfortunately, Republicans at the national level, they had some bad polling, some bad information. They came to me and they said, hey, you won the primary. It's a Republican district. You're going to win by 5 or 6 points. We're not going to give you any cash. The Democrats, who have horrible ideas, but they have really flawless political execution, they sat back, they watched the Republican bloodletting, they consolidated with no primary around one candidate. And so on day one of the general election, she was sitting on $6 million, a army of reporters from the New York Times and the Washington Post and all that. So they dropped another $6 million against me. Despite all that, we only lost by less than a percentage point. So I was basically portrayed as, if you were a Republican voter, they told you that I was a secret Bernie Sanders socialist from Portland. If you were a Democrat or a more independent voter, they told you that I was an extreme, Nazi, Republican, everything that we all get called on a daily basis here. But despite all that, we only lost by less than a percentage point. So I think unifying the Republican Party, because at the end of the day, my opponent, she's a freshman, so she didn't have a record. She ran as a moderate. She basically said that she was going to be this, extremely independent woman representing both Republicans and Democrats. But the second she got to Congress, she's voting every single day with Nancy Pelosi and AOC. I mean, on every single key issue, whether it's the economy, the border, crime, law and order, protection of our kids, she's voted in lockstep with the radical Democrats. So what I say to folks, and I talk to Democrats and independents all the time, I challenge them. I say, look, show me the elected Democrat at the state level, at the federal level, basically any level, the elected Democrat that stands for basic fiscal responsibility energy independence, that understands we can't continue spending money into oblivion, that wants to secure our border, that stands for law and order, and is against the sexualization of our children. Just show me the one Democrat, and you can't do it. And so then I say, look, those are the issues that I stand for. And I don't believe that that's like a hardcore conservative Republican ideology. It's just basic common sense. I mean, if you would have said these things 10, 15 years ago, people would be like, yeah, what have we been talking about? They would agree with you. But the Democrats have gone so far to I don't even know if it's the left. They've just gone so radical that they don't represent, I don't think they represent any Americans anymore. They don't represent any common sense Americans anymore. So that's my appeal to the people of the district. Let's unify. Let's actually get someone in there that's going to go fight for our values, because things are not right now. And everyone knows that. And we've got a unique opportunity right now, pretty much at every level, to turn the direction around of the country and make this a great place for our kids to grow up. Because that's what this is all about. This is all about the future for our children.
Absolutely. So it was so nice to talk with you today, Joe. Can you tell the listeners, if they want to learn more about you, what you stand for, how they can help you, where should they
Yeah,
go?
please go to joekentforcongress.com. Anything that you can donate is greatly appreciated. $5, $10, $15. I run off of all small individual donations. So joekentforcongress.com. There's links on there too to all my social media. So thank you so much for having me on today.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. So happy that we met. Really happy to have you on. And we will be following your race. We wish you and your family all the luck.
Thank you so much.